When an 8-year-old boy cries for help, who hears him? And when his bruises tell the story of unimaginable pain, why does no one act? This is the harrowing case of Gabriel Fernandez, a story of innocence, betrayal, and a system that failed. Gabriel Fernandez was a bright, curious boy who loved his family and dreamed of a future filled with promise. But his life took a tragic turn when he entered the custody of his mother, Gabriel Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Gabriel Fernandez. In the United States, a report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds. Yet for every case that is investigated, countless others slip through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. Gabriel's story is not just a tragedy, it is a devastating reminder of what happens when those cries for help go unheard. What went so wrong that Gabriel's cries for help were ignored until it was too late? And how could so many warning signs be overlooked? This is the story of Gabriel Fernandez, a case that shocked the world, exposed systemic failures, and left a haunting question: how could this happen? Gabriel Daniel Fernandez was born on February 20th, 2005, in the suburban town of Palmdale, California. From the very beginning, Gabriel's life was one of duality. He was surrounded by family members who loved him, but also by circumstances that would make his young life tragically short. Gabriel was described by those who knew him as a kind, curious, and loving child, a boy with big brown eyes, a shy smile, and a heart that longed to connect with others. He loved playing with his cousins and enjoyed small, simple joys like drawing and playing outside. For the first few years of his life, Gabriel was cared for by his maternal grandparents and extended family members. Under their care, Gabriel found a semblance of stability, a safe haven where he could just be a child. But this stability wouldn't last. Gabriel's mother, Gabriel Fernandez, reclaimed custody of him in 2012, marking the start of a heartbreaking and irreversible chain of events. Unlike the love he had experienced with his grandparents, life with Gabriel Fernandez and her boyfriend, Gabriel Fernandez, would become a nightmare. Palmdale, California, is a quiet suburban city in Los Angeles County, often described as a place where families settle down to escape the chaos of urban life. But even in such serene surroundings, behind closed doors, darkness can linger. And in the Fernandez household, that darkness was overwhelming. Gabriel Fernandez was a troubled woman with a history of substance abuse and neglect. By the time she regained custody of Gabriel, she had 4 children from different fathers, none of whom lived under her care. Despite her legal battle to reclaim Gabriel, those who knew her questioned her motivations. Was she truly interested in being a mother, or was she seeking financial benefits from government assistance programs? Gabriel Fernandez, Gabriel's boyfriend, was described by those around him as quiet and reserved. But beneath the surface, he had a violent and cruel nature. Standing 6 feet tall and weighing over 270 pounds, he often intimidated those around him, especially vulnerable children like Gabriel. Together, Gabriel and Gabriel created an environment that would quickly turn abusive and ultimately fatal. When Gabriel moved into their home, relatives and teachers began noticing changes almost immediately. Once a playful and happy child, he became withdrawn, shy, and visibly distressed. His body began to tell a story of its own: bruises on his arms and legs, bald patches on his scalp where his hair had been forcibly pulled out, and burn marks on his skin. These injuries were accompanied by Gabriel's subtle but clear cries for help. One of the first people to notice something was wrong was Gabriel's teacher. She observed that he would often come to school with new injuries, which he tried to explain away with excuses that didn't add up. On one occasion, Gabriel asked her, "Is it normal for moms to hit their kids with the metal part of a belt?" It was a chilling question that should have set off every alarm bell. Calls were placed to Child Protective Services. And yet, each time Gabriel was sent back home to Gabriel and Gabriel, a decision that would haunt everyone who tried to intervene. As Gabriel's life spiraled into darkness, the warnings piled up. He confided in his teacher, his classmates, and even his relatives. But the system designed to protect children like Gabriel failed him at every turn. This is where Gabriel's tragic story truly begins: a child whose bright future was extinguished by unimaginable cruelty and a system that turned a blind eye. This marked the end of a relatively stable period in Gabriel's life. Before this, he had been living with his maternal grandparents, who loved him deeply and provided a safe environment. His grandparents were hesitant to let Gabriel return to Gabriel's custody, but Gabriel insisted. She wanted to care for her son. Her persistence led the family to concede, though they later expressed regret over this decision. Almost immediately, Gabriel's life began to change. Living with Pearl and Isoro meant leaving behind his grandparents' nurturing home and entering a world of control, fear, and isolation. Neighbors rarely saw Gabriel outside, and relatives who previously had regular contact with him noticed that their communication was being restricted. Pearl Fernandez and Isoro Aguirre worked together to isolate Gabriel from those who cared for him. Reports from family members later revealed that Pearl would often refuse to let Gabriel's relatives visit him, claiming that he was misbehaving and needed strict discipline. Meanwhile, Isoro began enforcing rules that were far beyond what any child could reasonably endure. The abuse began with harsh punishments, but quickly escalated to acts of violence that were unimaginable. Gabriel's teacher, Jennifer Garcia, noticed frequent bruises on his body. On one occasion, he came to school with a swollen face and told her he had fallen. Concerned, Jennifer asked Gabriel if everything was all right at home. He hesitated before responding, "No." She reported her concerns to the authorities, but Gabriel was sent back to his mother and Isoro each time. The violence Gabriel experienced grew more severe with each passing month. Pearl and Isoro subjected him to physical and emotional torment. They used BB guns to shoot him, leaving small round scars across his body. He was often forced to eat cat litter and spoiled food as a form of punishment. On several occasions, Gabriel was tied up, gagged, and locked in a small cabinet in the apartment, a place he was made to sleep, curled up in darkness. When Gabriel's injuries became increasingly evident, he showed up to school with patches of hair missing from his head. When his teacher asked what had happened, Gabriel explained that his mother had pulled his hair out for the safest place to include it. Indeed, the claims did not appear to come from a virtual group of people, but rather from Gabriel's hands busy with patches of hair missing from his head. When his teacher asked what had happened, Gabriel explained that his mother had pulled his hair out. Jennifer Garcia once again reported this to Child Protective Services, yet no action was taken to control his behavior. On the night of May 22, 2013, Pearl Fernandez called 911 to report that Gabriel was unresponsive. When paramedics arrived at the apartment, they found Gabriel lying on the floor, battered and barely breathing. His body bore the evidence of prolonged and severe abuse. He had a fractured skull, broken ribs, and BB pellets embedded in his lungs and groin. His skin was bruised, his face was swollen, and he had burns across his body. Gabriel was rushed to the hospital where doctors fought to save his life. Medical staff described his injuries as some of the worst they had ever seen in a child. And despite their efforts, Gabriel was pronounced dead on May 24, 2013, just 2 days after being admitted. His cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma and neglect. After Gabriel's death, investigators began piecing together the full extent of what had happened inside the Fernandez household. Interviews with family members, teachers, and neighbors painted a picture of a child who had repeatedly signaled for help, only to be ignored by the very system designed to protect him. As law enforcement delved deeper into the case, they uncovered not only the horrific abuse Gabriel suffered at the hands of Pearl and Isoro, but also systemic failures that allowed this abuse to continue unchecked. When first responders arrived at the Fernandez apartment on May 22, 2013, the scene they encountered left them shocked. 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez lay motionless on the floor, his small body covered in injuries. The extent of his wounds was overwhelming, even for experienced paramedics. Gabriel's condition prompted an immediate police investigation. do the favor of subscribing, as it gives me inspiration to give you more juicy contents like this. Detectives quickly began questioning Pearl Fernandez and Isoro Aguirre about what had happened to Gabriel. Both claimed that his injuries were self-inflicted, alleging that Gabriel had been acting out. They told investigators that Gabriel had hit himself with objects around the apartment. These statements were inconsistent with the evidence, and the medical examiner's findings would later contradict their claims entirely. An autopsy conducted by the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office revealed that Gabriel had suffered prolonged physical abuse over an extended period. His injuries included a fractured skull, broken ribs, and burns. BB pellets were found embedded in his lungs and groin, suggesting he had been shot at close range with an air rifle. Bruises covered his body, and ligature marks on his wrists and ankles indicated that he had been restrained. The coroner's report concluded that Gabriel's cause of death was blunt force trauma combined with neglect. The findings painted a clear picture of the unimaginable suffering he endured. These injuries could not be explained by accidents or self-harm, as Pearl and Isoro had claimed. They were consistent with ongoing torture. As detectives gathered evidence, they learned more about the environment Gabriel had been living in. Interviews with neighbors, teachers, and relatives revealed a pattern of abuse that had been reported multiple times to social services and law enforcement. Teachers, in particular, had raised alarms after noticing Gabriel's injuries and his withdrawn demeanor. His teacher, Jennifer Garcia, reported her concerns on multiple occasions, but each report seemed to fall through the cracks. Pearl Fernandez and Isoro Aguirre, meanwhile, attempted to shift the blame onto Gabriel. Isoro claimed that Gabriel was defiant and difficult to control, while Pearl described him as a problem child. These statements were part of their attempt to deflect responsibility for their actions. However, as investigators dug deeper, the evidence against them grew. Law enforcement discovered items in the apartment that were used in the abuse, including BB guns, belts, and makeshift restraints. Gabriel's blood was found on various objects throughout the home, indicating that the violence was not limited to a single incident. Witnesses, including Gabriel's oldest siblings, provided chilling testimony about what they had seen. They described how Gabriel was often beaten, forced to eat spoiled food, and locked in a cabinet for hours at a time. While the investigation into Pearl and Isoro progressed, another question loomed large. How had Gabriel's suffering gone unnoticed by the system meant to protect him? Records revealed that social workers had received multiple reports about Gabriel's abuse but had failed to act decisively. In total, at least 6 calls had been made to Child Protective Services detailing Gabriel's injuries and the conditions he was living in. Despite these warnings, Gabriel was never removed from the home. Court documents later revealed critical missteps in the handling of Gabriel's case. Social workers assigned to investigate the reports often closed the cases prematurely, citing insufficient evidence. In one instance, a social worker noted that Gabriel's injuries appeared to be the result of normal childhood accidents, despite clear signs of abuse. This pattern of inaction was not limited to Child Protective Services. Law enforcement officers who visited the Fernandez home also failed to intervene. On one occasion, after a neighbor reported hearing screaming from the apartment, officers conducted a welfare check but left without further investigation. Each missed opportunity added to the tragedy of Gabriel's story. When the details of Gabriel's case became public, the outrage was immediate and widespread. The media covered the story extensively, with headlines focusing on the failures of the child welfare system. Candlelight vigils were held in Gabriel's memory, and activists called for reforms to prevent similar tragedies. In the aftermath, 4 social workers were charged with child abuse and falsifying public records. Prosecutors alleged that these individuals had ignored clear warning signs and failed to fulfill their legal duties. Although the charges were later dismissed, the case raised serious questions about accountability within child welfare services. Experts and advocates pointed to systemic issues within Los Angeles County's Department of Child and Family Services. Overburdened caseworkers, high caseloads, and lack of training were cited as contributing factors. Some argued that Gabriel's case reflected a broader problem within the child protection system, a system stretched too thin to effectively safeguard vulnerable children. As the investigation into Gabriel's death continued, it became clear that this was not just a story of individual failure, but one of institutional breakdown. Gabriel's case prompted calls for sweeping reforms and a renewed focus on the importance of early intervention. The legal proceedings that followed Gabriel Fernandez's death were not only about seeking justice for a young boy, but also about holding those responsible accountable for their actions or inaction. The trial of Pearl Fernandez and Isorel Aguirre began amidst public outrage, with many questioning how such a tragedy could happen. Pearl Fernandez, Gabriel's mother, was charged with first-degree murder and faced allegations of intentionally subjecting her son to months of abuse. Isorel Aguirre, her boyfriend, was also charged with first-degree murder but faced the additional charge of a special circumstance, torture. Prosecutors argued that both Pearl and Isorel were equally culpable for Gabriel's suffering and death. The prosecution's case against Isorel Aguirre painted him as the primary perpetrator of Gabriel's physical abuse. Witnesses testified about the violent acts Isorel inflicted, including beating Gabriel with a belt, shooting him with a BB gun, and forcing him to eat cat litter. The prosecutors argued that these acts were deliberate and intended to inflict maximum pain. Graphic evidence, including photographs of Gabriel's injuries, was presented to the jury, leaving many in the courtroom visibly shaken. Pearl Fernandez's defense argued that she was a victim of Isorel's influence and that she lacked the capacity to understand the full extent of her actions. However, prosecutors pointed to text messages and statements from Pearl that showed she was not only complicit in the abuse, but also actively participated in it. One text message revealed Pearl mocking Gabriel, calling him names and expressing no remorse for his injuries. During the trial, powerful testimonies were given by those who had tried to help Gabriel. His teacher, Jennifer Garcia, broke down in tears as she described reporting Gabriel's injuries to Child Protective Services multiple times, only to see no meaningful intervention. Neighbors also testified about hearing Gabriel's screams and witnessing his bruises, recounting the helplessness they felt when their concerns were ignored. Gabriel's older siblings also took the stand, providing heartbreaking accounts of the abuse they had witnessed. They described how Gabriel was tied up, gagged, and locked in a small cabinet for hours. Their testimonies highlighted the fear and control Pearl and Isorel maintained in the household. The jury ultimately found Isorel Aguirre guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstances of torture. He was sentenced to death for his role in Gabriel's death. Pearl Fernandez, who pleaded guilty to first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing brought mixed emotions to the courtroom. Some felt relief that justice was served, while others remained angry at the systemic failures that allowed Gabriel's abuse to continue for so long. Gabriel's grandfather expressed deep sorrow, saying, "Justice was served, but it will never bring Gabriel back." The trials also led to charges against 4 social workers who had been assigned to Gabriel's case. Prosecutors alleged that these workers had failed to properly investigate the reports of abuse and had falsified records to close the case prematurely. Although these charges were later dismissed, the public response was one of frustration and anger. Many saw the dismissals as another failure of accountability. Gabriel's death prompted widespread calls for reform within Los Angeles County's Department of Child and Family Services. Officials promised to implement changes aimed at improving the system, including reducing caseloads, increasing training for social workers, and ensuring better oversight. However, critics argued that these measures came too late for Gabriel. In the wake of the trial, community members gathered for vigils to honor Gabriel's memory. His story became a rallying cry for child advocates, who urged others to remain vigilant in reporting signs of abuse. Gabriel's teacher, Jennifer Garcia, summed up the feelings of many when she said, "We failed him, and we can't let this happen again." The trials of Gabriel Fernandez and Izuro Aguirre brought some measure of justice, but they also left behind lingering questions. How many more children like Gabriel are suffering in silence? And what will it take for society to ensure that no child is ever subjected to such cruelty again? Gabriel Fernandez's case is more than a heartbreaking story of abuse and neglect. It is a stark reminder of the responsibility we all share to protect the most vulnerable among us. Gabriel's death exposed significant failures, not just within one household, but within the systems and communities designed to safeguard children. Child abuse is a reality that exists in every community, often hidden behind closed doors. Educators, social workers, and neighbors are often the first to notice signs that something is wrong. In Gabriel's case, multiple individuals raised concerns. His teacher, Jennifer Garcia, repeatedly contacted Child Protective Services, detailing the bruises and injuries she observed. Neighbors called law enforcement after hearing screams coming from the apartment. Even Gabriel himself confided in others, hoping that someone would intervene. Yet, despite these efforts, the system failed Gabriel at every turn. Reports were made, but they were not acted upon. Investigations were initiated, but closed without resolution. This tragic breakdown has forced a hard look at how we respond to suspected child abuse. It has highlighted the need for vigilance, thoroughness, and accountability in every step of the process. Following Gabriel's death, Los Angeles County's Department of Child and Family Services faced immense scrutiny. Officials acknowledged that the system was overwhelmed. Social workers often handled caseloads far beyond what was manageable. Poor communication between agencies meant critical information fell through the cracks. As a result, reforms were introduced to address these issues. Among the changes was a commitment to reducing caseloads for social workers, allowing them to dedicate more time and attention to each case. Additional training was implemented to help workers recognize and respond to high-risk situations. Other trainings included new oversight mechanisms were established to ensure accountability at every level of the department. While these steps are meaningful, they are only the beginning of a much larger conversation about child welfare in this country. Beyond systemic reforms, Gabriel's story serves as a call to action for everyone. Educators, medical professionals, and community members are often the first line of defense for children in danger. It's not enough to assume someone else will step in. Every report, every observation, every question could be the difference between life and death for a child like Gabriel. It's also important to recognize the emotional toll that child abuse cases take on those who try to help. Teachers like Jennifer Garcia and first responders who worked on Gabriel's case carry the weight of these experiences long after the events themselves. Supporting these individuals is crucial as we work to strengthen the systems they operate within. Gabriel's death has left an indelible mark on those who knew him and on the public at large. Vigils held in his memory have drawn thousands of attendees, many of whom never met him but feel compelled to honor his life. His story has been the catalyst for advocacy campaigns aimed at improving child protection laws, ensuring that his suffering was not in vain. Gabriel Fernandez's life ended far too soon, but his story continues to resonate. It serves as a reminder of the immense responsibility we have to protect those who cannot protect themselves. It challenges us to do better, to listen more closely, to act more decisively, and to hold ourselves and others accountable. Gabriel's story is not just a tragedy, it is a call to action. His memory reminds us of the vulnerable lives that depend on our attention, our compassion, and our willingness to act. Let us remember Gabriel Fernandez and honor him by ensuring that no child suffers in silence again. Gabriel Fernandez's story reminds us of the critical importance of speaking up and taking action when we suspect a child is in danger. If you or someone you know is in a situation like Gabriel's, don't wait. Contact your local authorities, child protection services, our organizations dedicated to preventing child abuse. A single report could save a life. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. What do you think could have been done differently? Are there other cases you'd like us to cover? Share your insights in the comments below, and let's keep this important conversation going. Your voice matters. Don't forget to like this video if you found it meaningful and share it with others to spread awareness about the critical issues raised by Gabriel's story. And if you're new here, subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that shed light on cases of injustice and bring awareness to those who can no longer speak for themselves.